Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here. In this week's video, I'll be doing another one of my modelling guides, the theme of which was requested by various users over on my Discord server. I'll be covering all the ins and outs of surrounding filling, sanding, and rescribing your models where necessary, as well as giving some useful tips along the way. This video will essentially cover all of the knowledge I've picked up over my 10 years of modelling, so I really hope you find it useful. Let's get straight into it. Just before we start, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to all of my amazing channel members here on YouTube. Your support is absolutely invaluable and I can't thank you all enough. If you're interested in becoming a channel member, more info can be found by clicking the join button down below. Thank you all so much for your support. Right, let's get on with the video. The first essential step when it comes to fixing gaps and seams on any model is preparing the surface. So what do I mean by that? Well, the first very good thing to do is use a dab of isopropyl alcohol on a paper towel or cotton bud to remove any dirt or overspray around the gap that is being filled. This allows you to see exactly where the gap is and how you might want to tackle it. The next stage is the filling itself, which initially involves choosing the right type of filler. In general, I use two different products for various jobs. These are water-based fillers and CA glue. Solvent fillers like Tamiya Basic Putty can work as well, however recently I've drifted away from them as they have a tendency to shrink back over time, exposing flaws in a model's paint job later on down the line. As a result, I try to steer clear of them. Water-based fillers such as Bayako White Putty or Perfect Plastic Putty are perfect for tight areas or areas where surrounding details must be preserved at all costs, for example along the wing roots of an aircraft or in a wheel well. What makes this type of filler so good for this is their ability to be removed with just water, so no sanding is required. In fact, I'd never recommend sanding them as they really don't respond well to it. To get rid of any excess, all that is required is a cotton bud dampened with tap water. Finally, a product that I've recently started using for filling is CA glue. Now this seems like a weird one, as why would you use glue for filling gaps? Well, the great thing about super glue is that it doesn't shrink over time, unlike many other fillers. This means that the bond it creates between two parts is incredibly strong and resilient, especially if you use a rubberized CA such as VMS Flexi 5K. Whilst I wouldn't recommend using it for large gaps, CA glue is great for hairline or small-sized gaps in similar areas that would normally use a solvent filler, for example along fuselage join seams. Right, with the different fillers covered, let's get into applying them. Kicking it off first with acrylic water-based fillers, my first tip would be to pick up one of those precision applicator tubes that they're sold in. These allow you to accurately apply the filler straight from the tube, negating the requirement of a brush or toothpick applicator. Begin by applying a nice amount to the gap that you wish to fill and leave it there for about a minute to let it sink down a bit. Next, with a dry cotton bud, wipe away the majority of the excess, being careful not to remove any filler from inside the gap itself. This will essentially leave you with a nicely filled gap, along with some residue around the outside. To deal with this, you simply need to use a water-dampened brush or a cotton bud and carefully wipe away any of the remaining excess. Multiple layers may be required, so make sure to let it dry properly between these coats. Once you're happy with the result, that's pretty much all that's required. As I said earlier, no further sanding is needed, so as a result this is probably the quickest and easiest filling technique in the video. Something you can do to check if a gap is sufficiently filled is to spray the affected area with some primer, which will show you if the gap is still visible or not. Right, let's now take a look at using CA glue for more generic gaps and seam lines. Most CA glue bottles won't come with a high precision applicator, so what I like to do is squeeze some out onto a piece of masking tape and use a toothpick to apply the glue to the seam lines. The slight greasiness of the masking tape will slow down the drying time of the CA glue, meaning it will remain workable for a much longer time period. When applying the glue to your model, don't hesitate to be generous with amounts. You want to make sure that it's sufficiently covering the seam line, with enough there to sink slightly into it. You'll find that because the amount of glue you're using is quite substantial, curing times may be fairly long. My top tip for this is using good old-fashioned isopropyl alcohol as a catalyst. Apply a small amount to the glue and it should help in shortening your wait time. A more detailed guide on working with and applying CA glue to your models can be found on my channel, so feel free to check that out if you need any more guidance with this. So that's essentially it when it comes to applying these different types of filler. This next part of the video is really only necessary if you use the CA filler method. It is of course sanding and rescribing. Sanding down excess filler is generally a pretty messy process, so I definitely recommend donning a mask of some kind and using a wet sanding technique if you have access to wet and dry sanding sponges. The general idea is to gradually work your way up the different grades of sandpaper or sanding sponge until you're left with a smooth surface. I normally start off with something quite rough, around 400 grit, as it's vicious enough to remove a large amount of excess filler at a time without being too coarse. Then the intervals you take are up to you. I normally go from 400 to 600, then to 800 to 1200, and finally on to 3000 for a nice bit of buffing. In terms of the actual sandpaper itself, I'd definitely pick up some form of sanding sponge, as it's much easier to use than sandpaper and it also conforms to any curves on the surface, which is very handy. If you're on a budget, nail file blocks are a decent substitute, however. When you're sanding, I'd also recommend laying down some masking tape over the surrounding area in order to minimize any unwanted damage to details and other features. Once complete, cotton buds soaked with isopropyl alcohol can be used to clean any residue out of the model's panel lines and surface features. With any sanding required done, you'll often find that any surrounding panel line detail has been pretty much erased. Rescribing is the answer to this. It's not the easiest of processes, but there are ways to make it a lot more manageable. Some things that I'd highly recommend picking up are Dymo tape and a mounted razor saw, preferably with a very fine tooth pitch. The Dymo tape isn't completely necessary, though I find it's really helpful when it comes to making a perfectly accurate panel line, especially where the old one offers little to no guidance. The razor saw can potentially be replaced with the scribing tool. However, I believe the result achieved with a razor saw is far superior. I explain the reason behind this in a tool guide video that I've linked in the description. The first step is to lay a strip of Dymo tape flush along the side of the line you want to rescribe, so that you can nestle the razor saw right up against it without any issues. What I then tend to do is create the panel line in multiple light passes before going in for a harder pressing pass. This reduces the chance of accidentally slipping and gouging out the surface of the model. Once the panel line has been created, remove the Dymo tape, and then what I like to do is use a bit of Tamiya Extra Thin and run it along the line, which helps to smoothen it out and blend it into the surface. So this is all well and good for straight panel lines, but what about curved, circular or rectangular surface features? I've tried a few methods in the past, however the only way that you can really recreate these features is with a photo-etched stencil as shown on screen, paired with a tip scribe. Links to these products will be left in the description. All that needs to be done is the stencil lined up with the surface feature, taped in place and followed with the scribe. So that's essentially it for this how-to video. I really hope that you found it useful and that you were able to take something away from it, even if it was just one little thing. Do feel free to comment down below if you think there's something I missed, or if you'd like to find out more about something. I'm happy to help. Well, thank you all very much for watching, and another big thanks to all of my Modelling Weekly channel members, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one. Bye!